Hello, welcome to Queer Cinema Catchup. I'm Joe.
And I'm Allison.
And this is the podcast where we talk about movies, TV, and miscellaneous topics through a queer lens. And today's a very special episode because we have a guest, Andrew Proctor from Queer Frame Archive, here with us today. And we're talking about the movie Michael. But before we go into that, Andrew, please tell us all about your archive.
Queer Frame Archive. It's an online catalog and resource for chronicling queer representation in like the first half of cinema.
I'm really excited to talk about this movie that we just watched, Michael,
which we watched per your suggestion to kind of look back to early cinema. And I personally, as much as I love film and TV, I'm sorely lacking when it comes to early film knowledge. And so it was kind of exciting to dive into it. And I'd just be curious, what made you recommend this particular movie to us? Might be a good place to start. Do you think, Joe?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I definitely wanted to go towards something from like the Weimar Republic of Germany, which is like the period between World War I and the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Because that era in Germany was actually kind of progressive in terms of like its social values. So I was like, let me kind of like pick a movie there because that is such a unique, like singular short perspective of queer identity. And even then it's even like a smaller representation of that in film. And so I wanted to like pick that out and really highlight it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We kind of we didn't even look up the movie before we started, so we weren't actually aware that it was we kind of pieced it together as we were watching that it was a German film based on some context clues, such as their call for the English glasses, every so often. We were like,
Well, you were saying Russian.
Well, I was saying Russian for a little while, and then you said German, and you were right. But yeah, and then I was reading about one of the screenwriters afterward, and it is an interesting period of history because a lot of the work that she did, it seemed like she had written a movie about abortion, about other topics that I feel like even today are kind of a lightning rod in terms of are you progressive or are you not? And then I was disheartened to read that she then began to write movies for the Nazis, basically, because she stayed in Germany. Yeah. So anyway, I can hear what you're saying. I think it's a good one to pick because it captures a period of time that's specific.
Mm-hmm. And how many times have you seen this movie before, Andrew?
This was my second time watching it.
Okay.
The first time I watched it, I was like, oh, this is amazing. 4.5 stars on Letterboxd. And then I rewatched it the other day and I was like, okay, let's just knock it down to 4 stars, but still very good.
Wait, what caused the half a star to go away?
I think it's like the first time I watched it, I think I watched it on like an official streaming platform, but this time I watched it on YouTube. And it's like,
we watched it.
It kind of like took me out a little bit, and trying to focus on the story, I could tell there was maybe like quick developments in a character or story that I thought should have had more breathing room. That's kind of it.
That makes sense to me. We also watched it on YouTube, and the commercials certainly took away from getting sucked into the into the film.
Yeah. I have to say, like, Alice was like asking if I've ever seen a silent film before, and I honestly, like, aside from seeing like bits and like pieces of Charlie Chaplin movies, I really don't think I've ever sat through a silent film. I know Allison had mentioned she was required in class to watch D.W. Griffith's
The Birth of a Nation.
The Birth of a Nation.
Unfortunately.
But I like never like sat down and properly watched a silent film. And my expectations with like with a Charlie Chaplin movie, I feel like a lot of his movies are like these like wide shots where it almost feels like you're kind of like watching like a stage of like people performing. The camera's just kind of like set up and every now and then they'll cut to stuff. I was really impressed with Michael, just the use of, you had wide shots in there to like establish things, but many close-ups, like very many opportunities to, like, for these actors to like really emote. And I feel like, yeah, there were times where like people would like be like a little exaggerated to like express their like sadness or concern, but there was actually some really like subtle and powerful performances in this movie. So it definitely felt like, it felt like it was, I really enjoyed the experience. Like it was, at first it was a little like interesting to get into like the silence and like, and reading the titles, but then you kind of get used to it. And I really did get absorbed in the story, and felt emotionally gripped by it.
It's interesting. I don't know, Andrew, you might have more information on this, but one thing I read about the director, who is Carl Theodor Dreyer, was that the close-ups you noticed, I think, was a bit of a signature of his, and that was something that made his films stand out. And he also directed, I think the most famous, the one I had heard of before, was The Passion of Joan of Arc. I don't know if you have any more information about the use of close-ups or anything about the technical aspect of the filmmaking that you would want to share.
Yeah, I have a couple things. So one, it was actually pretty rare and unique to have such a diluted performance in silent film, right? Because it was silent and because actors were coming from the theater tradition, you had all these big emotions so that people in the back row could see. But, when you come into cinema, you can be very quiet, you can be very still. And Carl Theodor Dreyer and a couple of other contemporary directors made films, I was looking it up earlier, called Kammerspiel films, which explicitly kind of do that thing where it's you have wide shots, but also close-ups, and the acting is very modern almost. And Passion of Joan of Arc, that, I think 90% of that film is close-ups, and it's one of the best films ever made. And I think he really kind of found his voice and his style and his artistry in the close-up, and you can kind of see that in Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience to Joe, where I didn't really know, was I going to have to really, sit up straight and try and pay attention? But no, it was very easy to follow the emotional story, and I got sucked in, minus the YouTube commercials. And it did make me curious about watching, say, The Passion of Joan of Arc. And I did say that to you, Joe, in the beginning when we were watching it, about how silent film sometimes has exaggerated performances. But then as the movie continued, except for a couple of shots that we definitely laughed at, a few expressions, but I felt you saying that kind of highlights for me that there was sort of a muted or more naturalistic quality to the acting that I wouldn't have been able to identify myself, but I noticed, which is kind of cool to hear about.
Speaks to the power of the director for directing these, and power to the actors too, to just not overdo it at all times. And we're talking a bit about Carl Theodor Dreyer and the different works that he's done. And I think what's so interesting about him is he starts filmmaking in I think 1919 is The President is the first movie that came out that he, I believe, directed. And then his career spans all the way to the 1960s, which is so that just blows my mind to go from the silent film era to be working in the 60s is so it's hard to wrap my brain around. And it seems like D.W. Griffith, when Carl was just starting out, was a contemporary. They were making movies together, and then it seems like D.W. Griffith kind of fell out of fashion and didn't keep up with the times. But it seems like Carl continued to work on his craft and was able to kind of change with the very ever changing way films were being made.
I think that makes one fact, or one thing I read about the movie that kind of highlights that point, is that I think the cinematographer, I forget what technique they were describing as great in this film. I don't remember, but what stood out to me was that it ended up helping inform his ability to do multi-cams, which was helpful when he was working on I Love Lucy.
Cinematographer?
Yeah. I believe it was cinematographer. I don't know, Andrew, if that tracks anything you've read about it.
I feel like I did read that somewhere, that he also did I Love Lucy.
I was that really, because you're watching this old movie and it's black and white. It looks like it's from a total other time. And then you kind of see how actually we're not that far removed, and you can kind of progress. You could take a person in that film who was involved in the production and kind of trace it to something that's more recognizable to us today, I guess. Yeah. And that was wild to me.
That is wild. It just makes it seem this when Michael's being made, it just feels we're so far removed from it. But then also it's in this great scheme of things, it hasn't been that long since. So just crazy to see how much technology has changed, how much filmmaking has changed. And here we are.
I'm wondering. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Well, I kind of want to talk about the plot.
I'm wondering if we should do a little overview of the plot.
It's a really interesting story. It is not. There's so much depth to it. I don't know why I'm so shocked, but again, I'm basing everything off of like, I just assume with silent films, I'm like Charlie Chaplin movies. Like I just think these like broad comedies, and I just think there was like so much like nuance to this movie, and it was a very like frustrating experience. Just in some of the.
We did not like Michael very much, is
Yeah.
what we're trying to say. We were very angry at Michael.
The character?
Yeah, every time.
And I don't know if we're supposed to like him, right?
And I mean, I guess we can debate, because I don't know. But maybe we just quickly do a 2-sentence like overview of the Michael is a film about I would say famous painter who has taken under his wing a young man who had creative aspirations, but instead has sort of become a surrogate son and
just to clarify,
model.
You said Michael about a famous painter, but the
Michael
famous
is
painter
not the
is not the famous
Michael
painter.
is the young surrogate son / model who lives with I think
Claude Zoret,
Yeah, Claude.
who often goes by the master, right? Is that
yeah,
his
I
name?
think because he's like the paint, he can instruct. I don't really know. Probably requires me to know more about class structure than I do. Yeah. Yes.
Let's tackle one thing at a time.
Claude often paints Michael, and they're very close. There's certainly, I think it's pretty explicit, but I guess you could say it's subtextual that the surrogate son relationship might be more of a romantic one. And then a countess with perhaps who has a financial need and perhaps ulterior motives comes to be painted and sees that Michael is interested, and the two begin a romance that then disrupts the dynamic between Michael and Claude in ways that grow tragic.
Good overview.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to summarize the movie. And I guess we can just we don't have to go so in depth in every plot point. We can mix and match. We can start at the end, start at the beginning, start in the middle, talk about any favorite scenes that we have. Yeah, I think right at the beginning, my one, and Allison expressed this too, it was a little hard at the beginning to understand like the geography of where people were. And I think it's so interesting because they're still kind of figuring out the language of film, because it's like you would have like characters like look in a certain direction and like in a close-up, and then it would cut to something, and I would assume that actor's like looking at that person, but there were times where it was like they weren't actually looking at that person, they were somewhere else in the room. And so like every now and then I get a little confused by that, but in watching the movie, as I was beginning to understand it more, I think those confusions kind of dissipated. But yeah, I think like right from the start, I assume this movie, the movie's called Michael, so I assume it's going to be Michael. I assume that he was our protagonist, that we'd be following him, like a very sympathetic character. Not to say that he isn't sympathetic, but I'd say like Claude, this master painter's more who we're following. It's more of his story. And yes, like right at the top, we're like in Claude's mansion, and we can see that he like is a painter. He's like going through all these paintings that he's done of Michael, who's his model, and the master keeps like presenting Michael as his like surrogate son, but there's definitely some undertones, like Alice kept pointing out. She's like, well, he is nude in a lot of these photos. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, and the paintings.
So there could be some implied sexual relationship between the two, and then this father-son dynamic.
Their relationship is definitely kind of layered. I mean, you have him taking him under his wing as his artistic protege. You have him adopting him as his son. You have him treating Michael like a romantic partner of something of a sexual desire. So like all of those different like relationships, they can overlap, but they can also like butt heads. And I think that's what is really kind of like driving it, where Michael, he grows, he realizes he has other interests besides Claude, and so he tries to pursue them, and of course that messes things up.
Yeah, that's a good way. I never really thought about how it's sort of this dynamic is both parental and romantic, and how that comes into conflict as Michael grows into himself and looks outward, which is kind of a tale as time when it comes to parenting. Children always kind of decide to strike out on their own. But yeah, I guess what really just was hard for me, because I thought similar to Joe, entered the movie thinking that I was going to feel most sympathy toward Michael, that perhaps this would be kind of probably taking my modern lens to this, like there is a power imbalance, but the idea that this painter maybe would be taking advantage of Michael. I didn't really know what to expect, but that's where my head was at. And then in a surprising revelation was that it was Michael who was constantly stealing from Claude and just did it over and over and over again, and Claude never ever got mad, really. He just kind of kept painting Michael to the others in his life like, oh no, I gave that to Michael as a gift, or he would always kind of save face for Michael even if it was very hurtful to him. And it really made me sad for Claude and angry at Michael. So that was kind of my emotional experience of the movie, I should say.
And I felt the same way, where I shared it with Allison, where I felt more anger and frustration with Michael, and also frustration with Claude to like not let it go. And even like Claude had friends or bankers or merchants. I don't know who the man was with the glasses.
I think he was a journalist, is what it said on Wikipedia.
Wit.
Yes,
Wit. Who kept being like, he was like, drop this guy, like let him go, like move on with your life. And so I was definitely like frustrated and saddened by Michael's actions. But then Andrew, even how you like describe kind of like maybe like the there's more depth to it than like saying that Michael's a bad person, because you described Michael as someone who's like going out and finding himself on his own, which I think like I could see it through in that way. And so I think there's like much more nuance, like to say like one's a villain and one's the hero. It's a very like very subtle storytelling. And because so much of the story is told through Claude's perspective, like I feel like people are naturally going to kind of side with him and see the sadness of him, like kind of like this unrequited love or
unending. It cannot be eroded love is kind of how I would describe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he is an elderly man who lives alone, and Michael is his only other human connection, only other close human connection. And so I think it makes sense that Claude kind of like, is upset but doesn't get mad at, Michael stealing money, and like he gives him second chances because that's the only other person in his life.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's like, and he says, I'm the lonely, you can't imagine how lonely I am. I think is what he says at one point in time, and how he doesn't want to die childless. And everything, and his performance was really affecting too, because I mean, every time they held on him, it's just his face was so upsetting to me. And then there's also the component of Michael being his muse too, and how he's kind of lost his artistic way. And maybe Michael has found his way, because there's this the painting of the Countess that kind of kickstarts the plot. It's not satisfying to Claude, and then he has Michael come in the room and here, try your hand at it, and he paints her eyes, and that brings the painting to life, which then inspires the Countess to say to Michael, how could you know my eyes so well? And that kind of kickstarts their romance. But then later on, it's used against Claude to imply that, I think there was the newspaper article said something like, or a newspaper article in the movies said something like,
the only good part about this painting are the eyes.
It's almost as if another hand drew them, which I thought was really striking.
So Claude is the one who like claims that Michael isn't good enough to paint, but is good enough to model. But then we see when Michael gets the opportunity to paint these eyes, he like does an incredible job that is impressed by everyone. So it's like, how much has Claude been subduing Michael's abilities? Like he kind of like needs to go off and discover himself. But then
verbally not with the Countess, who wants him to steal money from Claude.
And that was like an early plot point that was like interesting, and where the movie ended up going surprised me, is this Countess comes to be painted by Claude, and Claude's having a really difficult time capturing her essence, which is why he asks Michael to paint the eyes, and he does it really well. But Claude seems to be really fixated on like models that are difficult for him to paint, and it sounds like in the movie it had been really difficult for him at first to paint Michael and capture him. And then once he like finally like succeeded on that, he moves on to the Countess and is struggling with her. And so I thought this was going to be a movie about like discarding people. Like I thought that like Claude was going to discard of Michael, because even Michael like shows up and he's sitting at the dinner table and he's watching how Claude is like obsessing over the Countess. And that's where I like pointed out, I was like, wow, like Michael looks really sad here. He looked so just like distraught and devastated. So I thought he was gonna be tossed aside. It was about him falling out of the graces of the master and like losing that. But that's not what happens. Is he starts a romance with the Countess, and instead it's Claude who's like left on his own. So I think that was like a really surprising point. And yeah, so that was like an early like plot twist that I did not see coming.
Same, actually.
It's a good point.
I'm curious. Oh, I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
Remind me. The beginning there, yeah, I remember we had that thought. We also, the conversation they have at dinner about death. Suddenly I became convinced that Claude really wanted to paint someone who was dying, and I kind of concocted a much darker version of the story where...
Yeah, the first 10 minutes, Allison and I were like, who's he going to kill? They're
going to
kill someone.
They're
going to trap
really
someone and kill them. We thought this was
disturbing.
going to turn into like a thriller. I was like, oh my gosh, this is...
The very first slasher film.
Yeah, exactly. But then one confusion, I think it might have been just because I looked away when these characters were introduced or something like that, because I never quite understood their role or who they are. But the other woman in this film who's very sad.
Was it Alice?
Yes.
Yes. Who was she? And
what's going on with Alice?
There's like a side plot that I was very confused by also.
So I think that was also a little confusing, to be honest. But I think it was like her and her husband came to Claude's residence. I can't remember why. But then she starts falling in love with... what's his face?
Another man.
The other guy.
Another man. And then you see their relationship, and
So
they go to the opera together.
Yes.
And like her husband gets jealous, and they have like a gunfight and kill each other or something.
yeah, they have a duel.
Yeah.
And then Michael's there at that duel. So there's definitely a connection. I wonder, because it's almost like, I do think like that Alice and her husband and the infidelity, that whole story was a little jarring, but I wonder if it was meant to function as a parallel, because there's like it's like a love triangle between Alice and those two men. So then are we supposed to then kind of attach that on to, is the subtlety of like a love triangle between the Countess, Claude, and Michael?
I'm wondering if perhaps when the scene where the husband sees Alice kissing the other man and then he comes and confronts her and she's very ashamed and he wants her to say something, and I think she says like, how can I say anything to you that won't hurt you, or something like that. And I think perhaps the idea is that we see her empathy, her shame, her human emotion, and we're supposed to contrast that with Michael, who keeps harming Claude but clearly not having that same reaction of care. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
But then, so I was reading the summary too. I think I was curious at the end when Claude's dying. He says, please go get Michael. I said, do you think he's going to come? Joe said no. And then he didn't come. And
To the show.
To know when Claude's dying, passing away.
Yeah, that was devastating.
But then I wonder, so the synopsis on Wikipedia or wherever it was said that the Countess got in the way of the message. And I don't know if I necessarily saw that happen on screen. But is that what we're supposed to take away? That maybe Michael would have been there?
I remember like reading that summary as well and being like, I don't remember seeing that in the film. Maybe it was something that was left out or something, where I think, was it Swit goes to visit Michael and the Countess, and then maybe the Countess is like, oh no, like he's not here or something. But maybe that's what happened, but I didn't see it in the film.
Yeah, I didn't see it either.
I thought that you commented, his name's Swit, not Wit.
It's Swit, yeah.
Swit. So Swit shows up to where Michael and the Countess live, and the Countess is like, seems to be very controlling with like the blinds, and she's the one that sees Swit.
It's after he died, though.
It's after he dies. But then I thought that you picked up, because then
she goes and speaks.
Swit's like screaming like the master's died, and then that's when Michael discovers that he passed away.
I guess
and so then I thought that you commented, you're like, oh, it seems like the Countess was withholding this information from him. We never see it on screen, so it's so I think it's kind of like we're supposed to feel this, like we're supposed to be upset, like seeing Claude die on his own and Michael doesn't show up. But then I thought the reveal is, that's why we see the whole thing was Swit, is that Michael like didn't know that the message was relayed to the Countess, and the Countess didn't relay that message to Michael. It's all, I think it's like implied, and that might not actually be what's supposed to happen. But I kind of think they were kind of like intentionally withholding some information.
Yeah, I guess maybe that I understand what you're saying. I guess it's hard since it is silent and you don't actually get to hear what they're saying. I mean, I probably did say that. I believe you when you say that. But I wonder, was he just reacting emotionally because he heard that Claude died and he did care deep down inside, or is it because he didn't know at all? So it's both the shock and the sadness. I can't say.
And it's a very alarming ending, because it's like Swit says that Claude's died. Michael finds out, and then the Countess is like holding Michael as if he's like a child in her arms. and then the movie ends.
Like comforting him. Yeah. It
Comforting
just
him,
ends
and
right
it's like ends like, oh my.
We were like, what?
Oh, no, where's part 2? I need more closure.
It's kind of like this, like going back to that side plot with like Alice and her husband and that kind of love triangle. I wonder if it's like when they dueled each other and one killed the other, maybe that was like Michael not coming killed Claude.
Yeah.
Or like hastened that. And so like, you know, it's that relationship of like, oh, like if you leave me, I will die from that. And so that's the ending.
And that ties back to the quote. I forget what they were quoting from, but it was, there's no greater expression of love than to die in the place of someone you love or something like that. So a duel, or the idea of actively choosing to not show up to someone's deathbed. I mean, it's not quite 1-to-1, but I feel like there is something to that where dying for love is definitely a theme. And then what do you make of Claude's dying words that I finally seen true love? Is that what he says? Or at last I have seen what true love looks like?
I think something like that.
He says to Swit.
I took away it's like to love someone and then they not show you necessarily the love back is like this, what's the word for that? That's selfless, unconditional love. The only reason why it doesn't necessarily work or impact me is because Claude seems to have that love for Michael throughout the entire movie. Like he doesn't really change much. Maybe there is a change in the fact that Claude only saw the value in Michael, in that Michael's this beautiful like model that he can paint, and then maybe like it translates into like once he realizes like he's not taking from Michael anymore, like he's not like using him as his model, and he actually like does have this selfless love for him. Maybe that's the change that happens.
Because if what Andrew was saying about it hastening his death, perhaps then the idea was him smiling and then saying that line and then passing away is like his gift to Michael. Like, okay, I understand now that true love is for you, the object of my love, and you need me to not be here anymore. So I'm going to set you free and die.
Gosh, is that what it's saying?
I think so. I didn't really get that when I was watching the movie. But between you two, you guys,
you need me to die, then I shall do it.
Or I wonder if it's like Claude is like, I've seen true love, as in Michael and the Countess is true love. Like that is the true love that he's seen, and he sees the difference between their relationship and the one he has with Michael, and so he's like, oh, that's true love. Okay. I don't know what it is.
That could be it too.
Yeah.
Both are dark interpretations. Wow.
I'd be curious to talk a little bit more about the Countess too, because for me, being so forgiving about like Michael like taking so much, what I interpreted to be taking so much from Claude so relentlessly, it always seemed like the Countess also seemed like more of a villain to me. And when I was watching the movie, I didn't really feel that like true love between Michael and the Countess. I don't know if it like the movie like painted it that way. I don't know if it's like the only real other like woman star in this movie is the Countess, aside from like Alice, who we see bits and pieces of. But I'm curious like why I like vilify the Countess so much.
You know, I think, and the flip side of that, I guess I knew she was destitute, and I'm sure I was like, yeah, she probably wants money, but I didn't really. I kind of just blamed Michael every time something was stolen. I was like, yeah, this guy, he's awful. Man, he's the mastermind behind all of this. And then later on, I was like, actually, I guess it could have been the Countess persuading him. But so maybe it's just my own bias, where I was like, no, the woman, she was totally fine. She did nothing wrong.
Well, I'd say that I was in the same boat where I felt like Michael was the villain for most of the movie, taking so much, because so much of like it cracks me up. There were these English glasses that they always brought out for special occasions, and it was just like so distinct, like, oh, the English glasses. And then eventually like Michael's supposed to have dinner with Claude, and then Claude's excited, he's like, bring out the English glasses.
But do you remember specifically that scene? We were both like, he says that, and then they zoom in on each person's face, including the servant
who has this ridiculous beard,
and their eyes, and me and Joe were like, oh my gosh, what's going on? What's passing between them? Like, what? This is so full of tension, but why? And then when they said, Michael's like, I borrowed them. That was a gutting moment. That's when I was like, I despise Michael.
Yeah, but it wasn't
English
even
classes.
Michael didn't even relay the message, right? It was one of the servants that said that the English classes had gone missing, and then it's implied.
But then I think Michael follows up and says, "I borrowed
Yeah,
them."
I think Michael does say that he took them.
So it's like in all these moments, like yes, it's like all on Michael, but then I feel like for me, the switch happens in that ending scene where I feel like the Countess withheld.
I see
that information.
I see what you're saying.
And then I guess I also like there were some like beautiful close-ups on the Countess throughout the movie, but whenever it would like cut to her, it always seemed like she'd have like kind of like more like shifty eyes, like she was like looking around, like studying things, and I was like, what's going on?
I did notice that in the beginning. She was looking at all the paintings, and yeah.
But again, I don't think anyone's like truly a villain. Like I feel like they could have fleshed out more of the Countess's backstory, but then again, this is like the 1920s. I don't think they had that on their mind. But
well, it's interesting. I read somewhere else, and maybe Andrew knows more about this, but I guess Carl, the director, Carl Dreyer, he was known for being someone who especially created or crafted complex female characters. And I guess
the Passion of Joan of Arc is
so I don't know if you have any more information about that, but I read that and I was like, okay, cool. Thanks Carl.
I don't have any more information about that, but that makes sense. I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, if you do Joan of Arc,
which
you better hope you can handle a complex person. But I read something. I really want to see that movie. I did not know that he took the actual transcripts, which question mark, they have the transcripts from the trial and created.
They had the script at that time. They automated.
I was just like, what? So I do want to see that. Maybe that's my next silent film.
Yeah.
But you reminded me of something else that happened that really stood out to me, and this is when. So that's the moment when I knew that Michael was someone I did not like. The moment where I felt the most pity for and the most concern for Claude was when, and could see the extent to which he would always love and forgive Michael, was when Michael sells the painting. I think it was called The Victor, of like his most prized painting that Claude doesn't believe you should sell because you can't sell away your beautiful memories, and he gave it to Michael.
And it's modeled after Michael.
Yes, as a gift. Mm-hmm. The Countess is in debt, and Michael goes, I know what to do. And then we cut to Claude, and his broker or his art dealer is there.
Swit?
No, it wasn't Swit.
No, it was someone else.
And he's like, sometimes the market's hot, sometimes it's lukewarm. But by the way, the Victor's back on the market. And Claude instantly knows that means that Michael sold it. And so then...
And Allison and I are this is going to be the moment where Claude is pissed off and finally tells Michael off.
But instead he goes, money's no object, buy it back and deliver it back to Michael where it belongs.
So not even just buying it back, but to return it to Michael.
That was a moment for me.
It was a really powerful moment.
That's crazy because it's like you're not just paying for Michael's money, like you're not just giving him money, but you're giving him the painting back.
Yes.
There's no punishment in this whatsoever.
No. And
it's incredible.
I wonder if this is like a good segue. Like we mentioned, like
queer represent. Wait, what?
Well, that's important to talk about too. But like Dreyer directed The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I should know what Joan of Arc, but it has to do with Catholicism, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Oh, the trial. It's based on her trial in France in medieval times, I guess. But I didn't. There's apparently a transcript of the trial. I need to look. I probably sound very dumb because I'm sure I'm missing some details. But when I read that, I was like, "What? I need to see this movie." Okay.
I think maybe since I haven't seen Joan of Arc, but I'm sure in that movie there's like much more overt discussion of religion and values. But I was really interested in thinking back on Michael. Is I feel like there's a lot of religious values and just that forgiveness, and then also just I think of what's the story about? Is it a parable? The one about the son who goes away and then finally returns?
The prodigal son.
The prodigal son, it gives me I think of that, and I mean again, this is the early 1920s. Religion is very sewed into the culture all over. So I think Dreyer attaches religious messages into this movie too, to just continue to forgive and
Yeah, you're making
and
me think about how we
understand.
kept talking about the little Jesus statue we saw. And then there was the big Jesus in his room on the crucifix, the big crucifix.
It was a giant statue.
It
That
was-
was a giant
Well,
crucifix.
first there was like a little, like it looked like a little, like maybe like Jesus, like a very small image of him on like a wall, and Allison's like, is that Jesus on the cross? And I was like, I can't tell.
And then later,
there's
like,
the same
oh,
version later on,
that is
a
Jesus on the
massive
cross.
version of it with like a massive cross. It's like, oh yes, I think that earlier one was Jesus.
You know, this is gonna make me what you just said, and the returning to the giant crucifix over Claude's bed as he's dying. I do think the takeaway of I finally seen true love is we're supposed to see him as a Christ-like figure who is dying for his
Yes.
love of Michael, so that Michael can be free of his sins.
Yeah, but
That's
what
It's deep.
it is deep. And what I like about this movie is that I feel like it's not so, like, yes, there's eventually a giant image of giant crucifix in the background, but I feel like it's not slamming you over the head.
No, it's very subtle. In
With
fact,
this-
I didn't really think of that like analysis until we were all talking about it. So
Yeah.
I do think it's subtle, which is maybe not to an audience back then, but
Yeah.
to us
Or that the
humans,
sensibility was like so, like it was like tied so deeply into the fabric that they immediately understood that.
maybe. Well, I also read that Carl. This is maybe we can go into like this is a queer movie. What does that mean in the time in the history of queer representation in film? But I read that Carl Dreyer apparently was known to be a pretty conservative filmmaker, that his messages were often very conservative, which is so interesting to me because this feels like a very progressive film in which it was portraying, to some extent, a queer love story
Yeah.
in 1924.
this
Which
does not
kind of goes to what you're saying about it being a more progressive time period. Yeah, so maybe we can delve into that. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, this doesn't feel like the God's Not Dead film series where they very overtly
I don't know what that is.
pound God. Just like those like Christian movies of like the 90s, 2000s. There's like a God's Not Dead series where like
Oh.
a teacher feels like he has to take it upon himself to
Tell everybody.
devoutly say that God is still real and you should believe in God and all that stuff.
Oh, did
feel
you
like
have to watch this in school?
No, it was just kind of like, I don't know. I don't know why I brought it up.
I'm interested. I'm gonna look it up later. But yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts generally about how this is a queer film? But yeah, what do we make of it as a queer film? I guess maybe is my question. I don't know.
I mean, I think, people that I've read have definitely praised this as like a landmark or, kind of milestone film in queer representation. And then you watch it and it's, it's all subtext. So that's very interesting. I do know at the time in Germany that homosexual acts were criminalized, but like the censorship institution that they had was very lax. So you could show homosexuality pretty openly in media. But of course, it comes up to that line of like, you can't actually be homosexual. And so I guess, they exploited the use of subtext a lot in these films.
Yeah,
I think there was a scene in the film where I can't remember what immediately preceded it, but it was like an insert shot of Claude like snapping his like tobacco pipe. And it's just, thinking about it, it's just kind of like a very phallic, you've broken my wood kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do remember that part, and I didn't really think of it in that way. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it is all subtextual because the text we get, which is not, I was gonna say the dialogue, but technically it's text, was all about this is a father-son relationship. But what we see on the screen in the way that they're looking at one another, the touches, the paintings themselves, it's implying something different or even something more symbolic than that, which now that you say it, yeah, it's very, very clear to me that is probably what it meant.
Well, I'm hearing to hear like Germany's take on homosexuality at that time, to hear that Dreyer is a more conservative person. I'm like, well, then why is Michael seen as like a queer film? Like, why is there even queer subtext? And I'm just like, quickly, just like Wikipedia, like Herman Bang.
Based on a book.
This movie's based on the book Michael, written by Herman Bang. And Bang was a homosexual,
Yes.
a fact which contributed to his isolation in the cultural life of Denmark and made him the victim of smear campaigns. He lived most of his life with his sister, but spent a few years living in Prague. with the German actor Max Eisfeld. He was uninterested in politics. He was distant from most of his colleagues in the naturalist movement.
Yeah, I read about the book and Herman Bang, which is a great name, being queer and out at a time. Yeah, it was unusual for someone to be out in the way that he was, and that he was isolated. And yeah, I don't know why Carl Dreyer chose to adapt.
And
Michael.
was it known in the book that there were these
I
homosexual
think,
undertones? Was it undertones in the book? I
mean, what's interesting is the Wikipedia says about this movie, Michael, also known as Mikal, Chained, The Story of the Third Sex, and Heart's Desire. So I would say those titles certainly imply there's something romantic going on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about the book, but there is another film adaptation of Michael from, I don't know, I think 8 years before this film came out, called The Wings or Wings. And that did not. Yeah, and apparently that didn't follow it was less explicit in that movie, which is kind of, I mean, how could it be less explicit? I feel like it was already very subtextual, as Andrew said. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm interested to just like reading this Wikipedia about Herman Bang. It says like the themes he was primarily concerned with, in quotations, quiet existences, the disregarded and ignored people living boring and apparently unimportant lives. I don't know if that's so true with Michael. It seems like
that they're all
Claude is they're all like doing very well for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess if Claude he does feel lonely. Like he's an outsider in the sense that he's lonely. Yeah. And then I guess perhaps Dreyer, I think, is also Danish and I think I had read born to like an unmarried mom, a married mother, and then I think was adopted by they described it as emotionally distant parents. So perhaps that informs his desire to kind of tell a story about loneliness. I don't know.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Like I ended with who knows.
Well, then I could speculate like, oh, that's why he was drawn to this material. But in reality, I don't know how the film system worked back then, and it's very possible that someone was like, hey, that Wings movie, that was pretty good. Maybe we should do another one, and here, Carl, here's your book. Go for it. I don't really, I'm not sure how the process usually works. Just like I'm not sure how the process today really works.
Yeah. I wonder how so much of so Andrew, just to give some background on Allison and I, we were raised Catholic and it's kind of woven to who we are and some of our thinking. And I just wonder you were raised Catholic also.
Oh yeah, the private Catholic school.
Same.
Up through college.
Same.
And so I just wonder so much of the Bible talks about Jesus helping the poor, Jesus helping the lepers, and it's just so interesting. It's kind of the compassion that he has for these minorities, these people that are outcast by society. So it's just interesting, especially I'm not too knowledgeable about homosexuality and the 1910s and the 1920s, but I'm sure it was kind of swept under the rug. But I wonder if for Dreyer to have such a connection to an interest of Jesus, I'm seeing on the Wikipedia page that one of Carl's great never finished projects was a film about Jesus. So I wonder if he saw this is all speculation, but I wonder if he saw some connection of compassion between this relationship between Michael and Claude, or if that's reaching too much.
No, I see it. I do. And I would be curious to hear, because what you were just saying about what was the queer landscape like in the earlier 1910s, 1920s. Andrew, what you're saying about the Weimar Republic and how it was a more progressive time. I knew the only real knowledge I have of that is about Berlin and the museum that was there that had a lot of material about sexual identity, trans identity, gender expression that was destroyed when the Nazis took over. And that's really all I know. So I'd be curious, do you know, is there anything else that we should be thinking about in the context of this movie about I guess, yeah, I don't know if that question makes sense. It kind of wasn't really a question, more like if you know anything, go for it. But no pressure.
Yeah, there were actually a few LGBT like organizations who put out like magazines and like were organizing with each other. And so like there was, you know, like an openness to be together, openness for community at that time. And a good portion of that organizing was to repeal section or paragraph 175, which was the criminalization of homosexuality, which had been on the books since the 1890s, I think, in Germany. But outside of like cinema, it does seem like the majority of queer presence was geared towards organizing community for political rights and civil rights, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, because one unfortunate thing I had read last night after we watched the movie was about that law that was on the books, and I guess they were not successful in repealing it, because that is what the Nazis were able to use later on when they did come into power. So yeah, I just feel like that background, I feel like the movie on its own has these interesting themes, and we can kind of read whatever we want into it, but then there's also this larger context behind it too. It makes me want to go back to film school.
Yeah, I think there's
do it.
Yeah. There just seems to be like a lot of rich history in this movie, and even like without that background too, like I feel like Michael's a very like enjoyable and interesting watch.
I do want to know, what do we think about how queerness is represented in the film? Like, do we think it's a positive with our 2024 eyes? Do we think it's like a positive representation? What do we think about it? I
mean, the fact that like Claude ends up like dying alone, and even though he's like surrounded by all these like servants and he has Swit at his side, it's still very like sad. And the message that I took away, it's like, if you choose to be homosexual,
you'll be lonely,
but you'll be lonely and you'll die. The fact that like that's even like put on the screen though, I don't know if like audiences were getting that at the time, but so the message is kind of like sad loneliness, but then another part of me is watching this in 2024 and being like, wow, they're discussing this in 1924, like how 100 years ago.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about how this was the celebration of the film.
100 years.
We should have said that right away.
Yeah, the fact that like I'm looking at this 100 years after it was made and being like, wow.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Queer representation on the screen.
The things that I see are like, okay, gay people are like in the arts. They're very successful. They're rich. But also they seem to only form, like the portrayal is kind of like they seem to only form close relationships through like coercion or some sort of like power imbalance, which, you know, isn't a great, you know, portrayal of us, but that's what's coming off of the screen for me. And like to Joe's point that, you know, like at the end we're just gonna die alone.
The coercion piece, absolutely there. The loneliness piece, absolutely there. And then also there's the obsessive piece too, which I guess you could read as very romantic, that he's never going to give up on his love for Michael, no matter how many times Michael wrongs him. But on the flip side, there's this it's sad that he can't be like, no, this he doesn't love me, and so I'm not going to keep giving my love back to him, and that doesn't happen. So that's another kind of negative wrinkle to it too, I suppose.
And the great tragedy of it all is Claude has so much. Like, he has wealth, he has talent, and the fact that he can't like find that within himself. I guess I don't think that's the point of the movie, but it's kind of like to not put everything on another person, I think is like a really valuable message alone. It's like you can see it as him dying alone. That's how I saw it, but he literally has Swit at his side as he's dying. So there's people that maybe care about him. He just can't see it.
Did we think that Swit? What did we?
I thought that Swit loves.
So there was some kind of
Claude.
some queer subtext to that too.
Yeah, I thought so.
Oh, I didn't pick up on that at all. I thought like when Swit was there at his bedside when he was dying, he was only there to chronicle his death. Like he was only there to get something out of it.
Oh, that's so
sad. Like even that wasn't like a genuine connection.
That's
I can
so
see
sad.
that, but then the fact that he like speaks to Claude so directly and says like, you need to let Michael go, like give him up. And the fact that after Claude dies, Swit seems to like emotionally and passionately run to where Michael lives and shout that Claude has died. Like I did think there's something to it.
The reason I thought that was a couple of things. Swit seemed especially aggrieved by Michael, and I wondered if it was jealousy. I wondered if he had used to be closer to Claude, and then Michael came around and kind of usurped his place. And then the scene toward the end, Michael comes back and is actually being kind to Claude, probably because he needs something. And it's like, oh, let me read the reviews to you. And he sits down next to him after like rubbing his feet.
Which, just like in the scene, The Favorite.
Joe was like, this reminds me of The Favorite, which was a very interesting comparison. And then Swit comes in. I forget how they get Michael to leave, but Michael does leave.
No, I think, isn't this the scene? Michael does want something.
Oh,
he literally goes to
I was so mad.
where
Sketches, I should say.
Claude has all these old paintings stored, and comically, and this is where it was really, really impressive. Sorry, I totally
no, go ahead.
Went over you, but there's like parallel action happening. We're seeing Swit is reading this like article or like some letter that Claude's received and be like, your paintings are worth $60,000. You're like in good company. This is great news. You can sell it. And as like Swit is saying this to Claude, we're seeing Michael steal these paintings and run off with it.
It's awful. Well, and also it was the which we haven't talked about, but the amazing Claude has lost his ability, he's lost his muse, he's not doing as well, and then the loneliness finally inspires him, and he locks himself away for years to paint his final masterpiece, which is this very striking painting of a withered old man on a beach, unable to stand up, and on either side are two beautiful young lovers staring at each other across this large panel with the sad figure in between them. I was very impressed by this painting.
Yeah, it was very striking.
It was very striking.
And the painting, the sketches that Michael stole are the sky, which apparently is the most beautiful thing that Claude has ever painted. The sketches alone are worth $60,000, which at that time I can only imagine how much that money must have been.
Yeah.
And then Michael steals them, and then they find that out, and then Claude goes, oh yes, I gave those to Michael as a gift.
And then Swit's like, really? Because I just saw him running out of the building, being really suspicious looking.
But yes, Swit in that scene, the reason I thought maybe there was some like romance is that he then repeats. But then this kind of goes to Andrew's point too, because then he repeats Michael's line of, oh, let me read the reviews to you. Almost like this, like, oh, this is the romantic thing we do. We sit by the fire and I read you your reviews about the artwork that has me in it. Only now it's Swit doing it. But then I guess if Michael really was just always using Claude, then I guess the idea that Swit is also using Claude tracks because he's doing the same thing as Michael. So I've actually now convinced myself the other way.
Yeah. I'm still open to believing that Swit.
I don't know. I felt there was something in his glances that felt slightly queer to me. I don't know.
And this is more like plot focused, but I completely forgot about the whole art show that Claude has showcasing that like 3-panel with the version of himself in the water with the blue sky.
Yes.
There's an incredible, beautiful, really modern looking shot where we have Claude in the foreground. I think it's when he's finding out that Michael isn't going to show. And then the old man painting is like right behind him. It was just like so well composed. I was like,
Beautiful shot.
it was such a beautiful shot.
It was amazing.
So yeah, just like really amazing cinematography too. And
that one character, the older woman next to Claude, who was like, the man in this painting looks like he lost everything, or like, something like that.
Yes,
and it's like, oh yeah, he did.
And so I can't remember plot wise, were there 2 shows that we saw? Like there was one show that showcases the Countess painting and then a separate show that showcases this old man painting, or is it all the same show?
I think the Countess painting, we only see them regarding it while they're painting it, and then we just see the newspaper article that details the critical reaction.
Okay.
Because Swit brings it to him.
Yeah. And then this movie itself is a period piece movie. Is it?
I don't know. I just assumed it took place like in 1924.
I mean, possible.
It takes place out of time.
There was no time.
While you're checking, Joe, I'm gonna. Sorry, I lost the. There we go.
I think it is just like a modern,
Like a contemporary.
well, it's based on the 1902 novel, so maybe
I see.
it's closer. But I mean, that was only like 20 years.
Still, okay,
18
maybe it
years
was
prior.
a turn of the century film, or a period piece about the turn of the century. I was going to say, you mentioned that scene of Michael massaging Claude's feet reminded you of the end of The Favorite, which I absolutely see, although in that my sympathy was not at all with Michael, unlike at the end of The Favorite, where I felt more conflicted about who I felt bad for, whatever.
That's a whole discussion of itself.
It
'Cause
is.
I thought I saw it more as Emma Stone getting her comeuppance.
Well, yeah, it was, but
She's like,
I just
"Shit,
was
what did I-"
imagining how that was going to be the rest of her life, and
Yeah, it's like, what
that's
did I get
horrible.
myself into? I'm
Yeah.
massaging this angry
Old
lady's
a lot of
decrepit
powers.
mansion with a lot of power. Yeah.
But it makes me want to ask, were there other movies, or like in terms of watching film today, do you see, because I want to say what are the antecedents, but that's not right? This would be the antecedent to other films. Am I thinking of that word correctly?
See, what does antecedent mean?
Like something that came before?
Sounds right.
I could be wrong, but we'll go with it. When you're watching, did you see any parallels to film today? That's what I'm trying to ask.
I mean, I was thinking about that for longer than I thought I would, like that question, because the story feels like very familiar. But I couldn't point to anything specific until, like, I think Joe mentioned, like, the Bible and stories in there, and I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then you mentioned The Favorite, and I was like, oh wait, I see that there too. The films that did come to mind, or at least one, was Suspiria.
I haven't seen it, but Joe has,
I
right?
have, yeah.
It's like a younger person coming under the tutelage of like an older person in a creative space, and there's like a very strange relationship of trying to like recruit them, and maybe some like homoerotic undertones.
Okay.
It's not exactly, analogous, but that's what came to mind.
Yeah, I guess, and that is a trope, especially in queer film or queer narratives about an older person kind of indoctrinating a younger person, and how that can be a bad message, but also it makes sense if there isn't a lot of information, or if there isn't a lot of opportunity to see yourself as a queer person and how you might exist in the world, then it does make sense that there's this template of like a mentor-mentee kind of relationship. And then I feel like that's really common. But the movie that kept coming up for me was A Portrait of a Lady on Fire, because it's so similar in terms of the art. The idea in that movie is that this one woman is coming to paint a woman without her knowledge because she needs to get married, and no one will marry her until they see what she looks like, and she lives on an island, I think, and it goes from what's happening, a similar relationship to what's happening in Michael, where it's the painter regarding the muse, and in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, the muse doesn't know she's being painted. But in contrast, in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, it shifts to the gays being equal, and they see each other fully, and that's why it's a beautiful love story. But
it's a tragic love story.
I don't know if I would say that. I feel like it's tragic, but also it's at the end she knows that they both know that they still care for one another.
Yeah.
Well, at least
But they can't be with each other.
no.
So it's a little sad. But yeah, I'd say not like traditionally. It's
They're both alive.
It's poignant. It's a poignant ending, I'd say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there was like a specific scene in Michael, especially. It's like they go to see. It's part of the Al storyline. I guess maybe. Does Claude show up? Michael show up? The Tchaikovsky Swan Lake scene where they like go to the theater, and like you're looking at people like in their boxes, and that reminds me like of the ending of A Lady of a Portrait on Fires.
Yeah.
Them in their separate boxes.
But that's actually not. Oh.
What do you mean?
So there's two endings of The Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I don't remember their names.
Oh, did they
but
actually go to and see like the painting?
The woman sees the painting
Okay.
of her and her daughter, but then she notices she has
She's
in the
holding
painting, her hand in the book to a page that was significant to them. I forget the significance. And then they go into the theater, and she sees her crying to the music that they used to listen to, but she never sees her. Anyway, that's the end. Oh, sorry, everyone. I just spoiled the movie. It's a great movie. Go watch it. But
Amazing movie. But yeah, I could also see like the portrait of Lady on Fire paralleling Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's like many influences, and I agree with Suspiria too, even though I wouldn't have immediately thought that just because it's such a difference in genre, but absolutely I see connections and similarities to that movie too. Wow.
Well, another thing. I have two other things. One was just a quick, we kind of alluded to it at the beginning, but we all watched it on YouTube, which naturally made me think about how, it made me more curious about how many of these what is the availability of these influential older movies? How accessible are they? I don't really have anything to say about that, but I just feel like it's something to note that we should have access. The public should be able to watch these films, and I'm glad it's on YouTube, for example, but I don't know who put it up there, and that's why what you're doing is really important. So if you have anything to say about that, you should, Andrew. I said you, but I mean Andrew. You should share.
Yeah, it's always important to save what we can and preserve what we can and share what we can. I know for Michael, I was reading this up earlier, and the film was considered lost for decades until I think 1958.
Whoa.
When they found a print. And I think once that print resurfaced and people could see the movie again with fresher, different cultural eyes, they started to appreciate it more. Like in the 1970s, I think Paul Schrader wrote a book that, highlighted Michael as like a very unique perspective of this era in film. And so like that, it just, if we bring stuff back, if we keep sharing it, we keep finding new ways to appreciate it. And I think it was put out on DVD in 2004 for the 80th anniversary. And so it was once again, spreadable to audiences. And then now it's on YouTube. But yeah, the quality on YouTube isn't that great, but at least it's there.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, so what platform did you originally watch Michael on?
I can't remember because the first time I saw it was a couple years ago. I want to say Criterion because, I thought like the quality was good and I was like, oh, this is like a Criterion film. But I cannot say for sure.
Because I'd wondered too, the like piano music that plays throughout. And there was also like on the YouTube version, there was like the sound of like, what I imagine like what the film is like the crackling of it. I wonder how like authentic that is to the actual movie, or if that was like added into post to recapture the feeling of watching like the silent film from 1924.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I guess it depends on which print they took the film from, if it's like, if they took a print that had those natural sounds in them and then just digitized that and put it up, then it might be there. Or maybe it was someone who added in later just because, hey, it's an old film, let's make it sound old. I noticed that there was like a couple versions of this film on YouTube. One where it was just like completely silent, and then another one that had a score underneath of it, but the score was not, like, it was made for the film apparently, but like it did not match the film like at all.
I wonder if that's the one we watched.
Yeah, it had music. You said there was either a silent version or one with music, and we listened to the one with music. Did you watch the silent version?
No, I watched the one with music.
Okay. I thought it was like effective at times. I thought the like music definitely like helped, especially if that was like included in original versions of the screening. If they tried to stay true to it, I think it helped the like emotional impact of things without overdoing it.
I don't know. I didn't have a strong opinion, but I've discovered about myself via living with and watching movies with Joe that I'm apparently very susceptible to the way music manipulates us in a way.
But there's nothing wrong with that. Film is manipulation. We're watching movies to be manipulated. It's all
you'll point out, you'll be like, that music was so overdone. I'll be like, really? I didn't even notice. And then there'll be a movie we're watching and there won't be any music, and I feel like I'm more likely to not like that movie. And then later on I'll reflect and be like, was it because there was no music? You know? So I guess I'm a simple person who wants to be.
Yeah. Music can be
Influenced.
so powerful to influence. And I don't think it's necessarily.
Well, thank you for reassuring me.
Yeah. It's important not to overdo it. And of course, in a silent film, like that's kind of the only option is to play music throughout. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Michael. This is Queer Cinema Catchup, the podcast to talk about movies, TV, and miscellaneous topics through a queer lens. And Andrew, could you please like let our listeners know like where they can find more information about you, about your work that you're doing for your archive and all that?
Sure. You can find my catalog archive at queerframearchive.org. And you can find me on Instagram at ANDRWPRCTR. So that's my name, but the only vowel is the first vowel.
I love it.
Yeah, please go check it out.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it, but we can share it to your yeah, we got to get that on your Instagram too, so that we can all
Connect.
Everyone can see everything. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Please check us out, and please check out the Queer Frame Archive as well. Thank you so much to everyone who was listening as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.